Thank you very much, Gerrit, and thank you for combining a picture of the future and the possibilities of the future with the challenges of now and the challenges of today. I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head that altogether too often we have the privilege of being with thought leaders in the field from around the world, and we forget what it's like to knock on the door of a little local authority and ask for open data. And I was there with my son, who was in one of the pictures. And the lady looked at him like he was crazy, didn't know what he was talking about. And the reason Gerrit used the phone was because it took the poor kid 3 weeks of calling 42 different places in a town that only has 3,000 people just to get the park and recreation information in a digital format. So, you know, we've had a nice discussion thus far about where the future is actually happening, where it may be heading, but the real challenges we still have at the grassroots level to democratize that future in a way that it applies to all of us no matter where we live. On the theme of democracy, I think we'd stop now and return to our poll. And if I could ask all of you when the question arises. And our question now is, do you trust putting your personal information on a government website? And I think that Gerrit's example gives us a good example of some of the possibilities if we did have that trust. And if I just ask everyone to vote. Aha, so we have our universal 98% that we had in the morning has not surprisingly diminished just a bit, but I still find the relative equal distribution quite an interesting finding. Shall we do one more question? Do you trust open data documents that are provided by an organization? And our figures are starting to rise a bit. All right, our next speaker is Ms. Tarouk Badawood, and it's a great pleasure for me to introduce her. She's going to give us a perspective from the Arab Administrative Development Organization, a regional perspective of the implementation steps that we need to not just open data, but to begin to implement data and bring it to life in a practical context on a regional level. I will say her presentation was very, very large with a lot of graphics, so it's not going to be available on your personal devices. And she will be speaking in Arabic for those of you that would like translation devices.
مساء الخير، أنا تغريد بدود مديرة العلاقات الدولية في المنظمة العربية للتنمية الإدارية. يمكن حضراتكم مش عارفة تعرفوا المنظمة ولا لا، بس خلوني اون بريف اديكم معلومات عن المنظمة. احنا منظمة عربية متخصصة تبع جامعة الدول العربية، مقرنا الرئيسي في القاهرة جمهورية مصر العربية، ولينا مقر إقليمي في مدينة الشارقة في الإمارات. أنا حابة أتكلم معاكم النهاردة شوية عن المنظمة، نشأة وأهداف المنظمة، مجالات عمل وأنشطتها، الحكومة المنفتحة والبيانات المفتوحة، وعن المنظمة العربية ودورها في مجال الحكومة المفتوحة والأنشطة المستقبلية لعام 2014-2015. الحقيقة المنظمة أنشئت سنة 1961 كأحد المنظمات المتخصصة المنبثقة عن جامعة الدول العربية لتتولى مسؤولية التنمية الإدارية في المنطقة العربية. وتتحدد رسالة المنظمة في الإسهام في تحقيق التنمية الإدارية والتنمية الشاملة بما يخدم قضايا التنمية الإدارية في المنطقة العربية. الحقيقة المنظمة بتكون مجازة المنظمة مكونة من 3 أجهزة رئيسية، هي المجلس التنفيذي والجمعية العمومية والمديرية العامة، ودول مكونين من وزراء التنمية الإدارية ووزراء الخدمة المدنية في الدول العربية، دول البورد الخاص بالمنظمة. الحقيقة أنشطة المنظمة بتتراوح ما بين أنشطة خاصة بالتنمية البشرية والتنمية المؤسسية. فاحنا بنتكلم على علاقات عربية ودولية، بنتكلم على بحوث ودراسات، استشارات، خدمات استشارية، أنشطة وبرامج تتراوح ما بين مؤتمرات وملتقيات وندوات وبرامج ورش عمل. نتكلم على تدريب، برامج خاصة ودبلومات وشهادات مهنية وتكنولوجيا معلومات. بنتكلم عن معلومات وديجيتال لايبرري وجوائز تشجيعية. باختصار هقول لكم ان المنظمه الحقيقه ليها علاقات عمل وطيده مع عدد كتير من المنظمات الدوليه زي اليونايتد نيشنز، وورلد بانك جروب، ترانسبيرنسي انترناشونال، اورجانيزيشن فور ايكونوميك كوبريشن اند ديفلوبمنت، الاو اي سي دي، من او سي دي جافرمنت تريننج سنتر ان كازيرتا، وغيرها من المنظمات العامله في مجال التنميه الاداريه والتنميه البشريه الدوليه. الحقيقه احد الانشطه المميزه للمنظمه اللي بتاعنا بيها هي من نشاط البحوث والدراسات، فهي الحقيقه عندنا مجموعه من الكتب بتبقى اصدارات بصوره ورقيه وبصوره الكترونيك فورم، ودي افيلابل موجوده على الويب سايت بتاعتنا. هي عندنا 3 انواع من الدوريات البريوديكلز، ففي جورنال اسمه المجله العربيه للاداره، نشره اخبار الاداره العربيه ديتس نيوز ليتر، كوارترلي نيوز ليتر، وفي مجازين اسمها مجله الاداره، دي بتطلع كل شهر. بيسايد الاصدارات المنظمه احنا بنقوم بتوزيع المطبوعات الخاصه بالمنظمات الدوليه والمنظمات العربيه ومراكز البحوث والدراسات، بلس ان احنا بنشارك في معارض الكتب الدوريه بهدف ان احنا نعرض الكتب بتاعتنا والكتب والبحوث والدراسات والاصدارات الموجوده في المنطقه العربيه كلها. دي بعض النماذج للاصدارات. This is the journal الخاص بالمنظمه، المجله العربيه للاداره. دي نشره اخبار الاداره العربيه، الكوارترلي نيوز ليتر. دي بعض الكتب المترجمه اللي قامت المنظمه بترجمتها بالتعاون مع عدد من المنظمات الدوليه زي منظمه الشفافيه العالميه والاورجانيزيشن فور كوبريشن ديفلوبمنت، الاو اي سي دي. احنا بنتكلم في دوريات، كتب، مؤتمرات مختلفه الموضوعات كلها بتصب في مجال الاداره. زي ما حضراتكم عارفين ان المانجمنت هو كروسنج سيكتور كل القطاعات، وهو حاجه مهمه جدا في كل مؤسساتنا العربيه، بتختلف بقى من دولنا العربيه. انا بتكلم النهارده من منظور ريجنال ليفل، من منظور اقليمي، وانتم عارفين دولنا العربيه الحقيقه بتختلف كتير قوي، من اول دول الخليج للدول الليست ديفلوب كانتريز. احنا بنتكلم على السودان، بنتكلم على الامارات، بنتكلم على الكويت. فالحقيقه شغل المنظمه بيكون على ريجنال ليفل. لو بتكلم عن الخدمات الاستشاريه، الحقيقه المنظمه بتقدم استشارات لعدد كبير من المؤسسات الحكوميه على المستوى الوزاري، على مستوى الوزارات، وعلى مستويات القطاع الخاص. والخدمات الاستشاريه بتتعرض لعدد موضوعات مثل اعداد خطط لاصلاح الخدمه المدنيه، الدراسات التشخيصيه والخطط الاستراتيجيه لنمو المؤسسات، اعاده هيكله، تطوير الموارد البشريه، تخطيط الاستراتيجي للمؤسسات. برضو من أحد الأنشطة اللي بتقوم بها المنظمة اللي هو عقد عدد من المؤتمرات والندوات والملتقيات وورش العمل، ودي بتكون على الصورة الإقليمية أو الصورة الدولية، وبتعقد في المنطقة العربية أو خارج المنطقة العربية. as a regional organization، منظمة عربية، احنا بنقوم الحقيقة بتقديم خدماتنا في كافة الدول العربية بلس الدول الأوروبية recently. في التدريب الحقيقه احنا عندنا 3 مستويات للتدريب. عندنا برامج تدريبيه خاصه، دي بتتناول موضوعات زي الجوده ومؤسسات العلاقات العامه والاعلام والبرامج القانونيه والرقابيه وغيرها. دبلومات والشهادات المهنيه، الحقيقه المنظمه بتعطي عدد من الدبلومات والشهادات المهنيه المتخصصه زي دبلوم اداره المستشفيات، اداره الموارد البشريه and so on. برامج ماليه محاسبيه بلس التاهيل للبرامج الشهادات المهنيه زي السي بي اي، سي ام اي، سي اف اي. الحقيقه احنا الهدف من الوحده دي ان هي كانت تقلل الجاب اللي موجوده ما بين مخرجات التعليم ومتطلبات سوق العمل. يعني الحقيقه عندنا خريجين كتير قوي، لكن متطلبات الوظائف بتتطلب تاهيل معين لهؤلاء الخريجين، فقمنا بانشاء الوحده دي عشان تدي دبلومات مهنيه. This is not a professional certificate, this is not an academic certificate, it's a professional certificate. تكنولوجيا المعلومات، الحقيقه احنا عندنا ديبارتمنت كبير قوي مختص ببرامج تدريب تكنولوجيا المعلومات على كافه المستويات، من اول برامج تدريب في الشبكات، امن المعلومات، برامج الجمركيه، دبلومات تكنولوجيا المعلومات وغيرها. الحقيقه الخدمات بتاعتنا او الانشطه بتاعتنا بتتعرض لكافه المستويات الاداريه العليا والوسطى والاشرافيه، اهتماما زي ما قلت لحضراتكم ان احنا بنهتم بالمان باور وبنهتم بالتطوير المؤسسي. بالتالي دولت النقطتين الاساسيين اللي احنا هنتكلم عليهم النهارده في الاوبن جفرمنت والاوبن داتا. باختصار كده الشارت دي بتبين عدد الأنشطة. لو قلنا إن إحنا في 2013 قدمنا 754 نشاط بإجمالي مشاركين 7309، دول المتدربين في كافة المجالات الإدارية وكافة القطاعات. دي برضو شارت بيبين توزيع الفعاليات وبرامج خاصة وتكنولوجيا معلومات وغيرها. ديجيتال لايبرري الحقيقه واحده من المميزات المنظمه اللي احنا بنفتخر بيها، اللي هو المكتبه الرقميه. احنا عندنا اول ديجيتال لايبرري على مستوى العالم العربي، مكتبه حمد بن راشد بدعم سمو كريم من السمو الحاكم حمد بن راشد. مقتنيات المكتبه الحقيقه فيها رسائل علميه واصدارات وكتب وقاعده للدوريات البريوديكالز المتخصصه في مجال الاداره. يمكن احنا بندي تدريب في مجال المعلومات والمكتبات، عندنا اعضاء في الامبان ممبر في الامبان نتورك بلس عندنا ارادو بورتال، كل الانفورميشن الخاصه بمخرجات المنظمه از افيلبل على ديجيتال فورم في ارادو بورتال، البورتال الخاص بالمنظمه. اخر حاجه بحب اتكلم عنها الجوائز التشجيعيه، اللي الحقيقه المنظمه بتعطي عدد من الجوائز في مختلف قطاعات الاداره. احنا عندنا جائزه المملكه العربيه السعوديه للاداره البيئيه، في جائزه الشارقه لافضل اطروحه الدكتوراه في العلوم الاداريه في الوطن العربي، واخر حاجه جائزه الامير سلمان بن عبد العزيز في الاداره المحليه العربيه. ده برضو حاجه تشارت بتبين الموضوعات اللي احنا بنتكلم فيها. احنا بنتكلم على الجفرنس حوالي 68 نشاط، على الشباب 14 نشاط، على الترانسبيرنسي نشاط، دور المراه 3، الرقابه الاداريه، اداره الازمات، بعدد المشاركين على كافه القطاعات. برضو ده تطور اعداد المشاركين من اول 2007 ل 2013. يمكن موضوعنا النهارده الخاص بالاوبن جفرمنت والاوبن داتا، انا حبيت ان انا ادي لحضراتكم نبذه كده عن المنظمه عشان تعرفوا احنا السيكتور اللي احنا بنخدمه. الحقيقه السيكتور زي ما قلت لكم دوت مختلف جدا. احنا لما بنتكلم على الاوبن جفرمنت وفقا لتعريف الاو اي سي دي، هي الالتزام بمبدا الشفافيه في الاجراءات الحكوميه وسهوله الحصول على الخدمات الحكوميه والمعلومات، وقدره الحكومه على الاستجابه للافكار والمطالب والاحتياجات المواطنين. ده التعريف العام اللي كلنا عارفينه على الاوبن جفرمنت. بنتكلم على 3 حاجات اساسيه، بنتكلم على ترانسبيرنسي شفافيه، بنتكلم على مشاركه، بنتكلم على محاسبه او مساءله. يمكن عشان نحقق الحكومه المنفتحه احنا عايزين متطلبات محتاجينها عندنا في المنطقه العربيه. بنتكلم على ضغوط مجتمعيه ومجتمع مدني يقظ قادر ان هو يعرف ايه اللي موجود في المنطقه ويعرف حقوقه ايه. بنطلب على بيئه سياسيه مستقره وداعمه عشان تدعم التحول للحكومه الالكترونيه. بنتكلم على اطار تشريعي واجرائي، الفريم اللوجيستيكال فريم ورك، عشان يخلي كل فرد لينا يقدر يحصل على المعلومات والاستفاده. محتاجين انفراستراكشر مؤسسي تنظيمي وتكنولوجي. محتاجين مان باور، محتاجين قوة بشرية مؤهلة تقدر انها تتعامل مع الداتا وتقدر انها تستوعب الداتا انا كمتلقي وكمصدر. محتاجين اعلام يقدر ان هو يتكلم معانا ويفهم الناس البسيطة احنا بنتكلم عن ايه والداتا دي هاو تو بي يوزد. محتاجين اليات للمساءلة عن عدم الافصاح والبيانات اللي بتطلع عندنا. يمكن احنا بعض التحديات اللي احنا عايزينها في المنطقه العربيه، هل احنا عندنا فعلا دعم سياسي حقيقي لمشروع التحول نحو الاوبن جفرمنت والاوبن داتا في الحكومات؟ هل احنا بنستعملها بس مجرد كلام؟ انا مش بتكلم على دوله محدده، انا بتكلم على 22 دوله، 22 دوله مختلفه من اولها من اول القوى البشريه لحد الامكانيات الماديه. هل احنا عندنا نظم اداريه واجرائيه تدعم التحول الحكومه المنفتحه؟ هل عندنا سيستمز بتخلي بتساعدنا للتحول الحكومه المنفتحه؟ والبيانات اللي موجوده دي هل هي ذات قيمه مضافه للمواطنين للستيك هولدرز كلهم؟ واخر سؤال، هل الجميع متضامنين؟ الحكومات مع الافراد مع الاعلام، هل كل الناس دي مع بعض ان هارموني؟ لو اتكلمنا على الاوبن داتا كتعريفها، هي البيانات اللي يمكن بحريه استخدامها واعاده استخدامها وتوزيعها من قبل اي شخص وفق للشروط الخاصه بالاستخدام والنشر. ده الاوبن داتا. الجفرمنت داتا بيانات الحكومه هي البيانات والمعلومات المنتجه في الحكومه او بتكليف من الهيئات العامه. ايه متطلبات البيانات المفتوحه؟ انا محتاج ستاندردز لتجميع وتعريف معامله البيانات، انا محتاج اطار تشريعي، انا محتاجه قوه بشريه مؤهله. الحقيقه المنظمه من تعاملنا في المنطقه العربيه ومن دورنا التنموي وخدمتنا از نون فور بروفيت اورجانيزيشن، منظمه غير هادفه للربح وتسعى للتنميه الاداريه والتنميه الشامله في المنطقه العربيه، فكان عندها هدف ان احنا بنواجه التحديات دي، بنواجه تحديات الحكومه المفتوحه والتحول نحو الرقميه والاوبن داتا والاوبن جفرمنت عن طريق ان احنا بنقوم بتقديم عدد من الانشطه مثل البرامج والمؤتمرات والدورات التدريبيه اللي انا ذكرتها لحضراتكم في الاول، والاستشارات في مجالات متعدده. بنتكلم على الكاباسيتي بيلدينج، بنتكلم على الترانسبيرنسي، بنتكلم على الاكاونتابيلتي، على التشينج مانجمنت and how to develop legal framework standardization for data publishing, promoting the idea of publishing information via multiple delivery channels. نتكلم عن انترنت وموبايل وميديا. كل دي بعض الموضوعات اللي احنا بنحاول نتعامل معاها في المنطقه العربيه. بنتعامل معها على عده مستويات، بدايه من المستوى الاليمنتري المبدئي لحد المستويات العليا اللي احنا بنخاطبها، لان انا بتعامل مع موظفين صغيرين قوي من خلفيات ثقافيه وتعليميه مختلفه لموظفين كبار متعلمين على احدث النظم الحديثه وفاهمين احنا بنتكلم على ايه. انا بتكلم مع حكومات عندها موارد ماديه انها تو امبلمنت، وحكومات عندها موارد ماديه انها ما عندهاش موارد ماديه ما تقدرش تستثمر في البشر او تستثمر في التكنولوجي او تستثمر في فكره اطاري وتشريعي. فالحقيقه انا بتكلم على ندوات، بتكلم على تدريب، بحوث ودراسات، بتكلم على استشارات. كل ده بيعقد اما طبعا المنظمه بتعقده بالتعاون مع حكومات الدول الاعضاء، مع منظمات دوليه ومع خبراء دوليين. بيبقى upon request من الدوله لما بتطلب مثلا من المنظمه انها تقوم بتقديم استشاره للتحول مثلا نحو الحكومه الالكترونيه، التحول نحو الرقميه، الاوبن داتا، الاوبن جفرمنت اند سو اون. ده بيبقى upon request من الدول العربيه. ده الاتجاه الثاني ان احنا بنحاول ننشر هذا الفكر في المنطقه العربيه من دور المنظمه التثقيفي والتنويري في المنطقه العربيه، وادخال الموضوعات الجديده للدول الاقل نموا. يمكن زي دي نفس السلايد اللي انا عرضتها، بس حبيت اعرضها مره تانية عشان يمكن هنا هتوضح اكتر البرامج اللي احنا بنقدمها مع اعداد المشاركين. في مجال الحكومه الالكترونيه، يمكن واحده من المجالات اللي حبيت اعرضها لكم برضو، احنا قدمنا 2012 25 نشاط في مجال الحكومه الالكترونيه. دي برضو برامج تدريبيه، ده 2013. السلايد دي بتتكلم على 2013 السيلف اكسبلاناتوري. انا اسفه. برضو حابه اديكم بعض النماذج عن انشطه المنظمه از هيدلاينز يعني كده، طبعا مش حاجه تفصيليه. انا لما بتكلم عن الاوبن جفرمنت والاوبن داتا، انا بتكلم عن الجود جفرنانس، وبتكلم على بناء دولة المؤسسات. فأنا كان عندي المؤتمر السنوي العام، يمكن احنا المنظمة بقالها 3 سنين بتتبع المؤتمر السنوي العام بتاعنا. ده أكبر نشاط بتقيمه المنظمة، بيتكلم عن أحد الموضوعات المتعلقة بالإدارة الرشيدة والجود جفرنانس وحالة الحوكمة والإدارة العامة في الدول العربية. أنشطة المنظمة برضو حاجة مميزة قوي، اللي هي التجارب الإدارية الناجحة. التجارب الإدارية الناجحة البيست براكتسز دي بتعرض التجارب الموجودة في المنطقة العربية والتجارب الدولية في المميزة لدى كل دولة. يعني مثلا أنا حبيت اخترت لحضراتكم بعض الموضوعات اللي ممكن تبقى في قلب الموضوع بتاعنا. تجربة إدارة المعرفة الحكومية، دي قدمتها برنامج دبي الإداء الحكومي المتميز. نظام إدارة سير العمل متكامل، هيئة الحكومة الإلكترونية برئاسة شؤون مجلس الوزراء بمملكة البحرين. احنا بنعرض التجارب دي في مختلف الدول العربية عشان نبين احنا ايه التجارب المميزة ايه والناس نفذتها ازاي، وايه المشاكل اللي قابلت القائمين على هذا النشاط او قائمين على هذه التجربة، وبنعرضها في دول عربية مختلفة. وكل المشاركين بيبقوا من مختلف الدول العربية، ال 22 دولة عربية عندنا، عشان بنحاول ان احنا ننشر الفكر الإداري. يمكن احد التجارب برضو المميزه دولة قطر في الاداره الالكترونيه وغيرها بقى. يعني من التجارب الدوليه عندنا تجربه البرتغال، فكر المشاوره العامه البسيطه، وتجربه شبكه المعرفه المشتركه للوكاله البرتغاليه للتحديث الاداري. برضو دي نماذج للندوات والمؤتمرات، منها مثلا دور الحكومه الالكترونيه في تبسيط الاجراءات، امن المعلومات. الاجتماع السنوي، الحقيقه احنا بنعمل اجتماع سنوي لقياده المعلومات في تكنولوجيا المعلومات في العالم العربي. دي برضو عينات نماذج لورش العمل اللي بتقيمها المنظمه. دور تكنولوجيا المعلومات في تطوير الموارد البشريه، زي ما قلت لحضراتكم ان احنا بنتكلم على هيومن ديفلوبمنت، بنتكلم على انستتيوشنال ديفلوبمنت، بنتكلم على ليجيسليشن اطار تشريعي، بنتكلم على ميديا، بنتكلم على مختلف القطاعات لما بنبص لها بصوره اجماليه للمنطقه العربيه. برضو من الأنشطة اللي احنا اشتغلنا بيها في مجال الأوبن جفرمنت والأوبن داتا والجفرنانس والترانسبيرنسي، البحوث والدراسات والإصدارات. فزي ما قلت لحضراتكم احنا عندنا أكتر من 600 إصدار أصدرته المنظمة. يمكن آخر 5 سنين احنا طلعنا منهم 80 إصدار متعلق بالمساءلة والشفافية والحوكمة والحكم الرشيد والأوبن داتا والأوبن جفرمنت والحكومة الإلكترونية. دي برضو نماذج لبعض الإصدارات الموجودة في المنظمة، سواء كانت إن إلكترونيك فورم بصورة إلكترونية أو بصورة ورقية. طبعا حضراتكم عارفين إن مش كل الدول العربية برضو ليها القدرة ولا عندها الإمكانيات، ولا كل الباحثين عندهم إمكانيات إن هم يطلعوا بصورة إلكترونية على الإصدارات، لاختلاف دولنا العربية زي ما كلنا عارفين. عشان كده في حاجات كل المطبوعات افيلابل على الويب سايت بالسوفت كوبي، لكن برضو موجودة هارد كوبي افيلابل اللي ما بيقدروش يستخدموها او ما عندهمش الاكسس. دي سامبلز للاصدارات بتاعتنا برضو. يمكن 2014 حبيت اعرض لحضراتكم بعض الانشطه اللي احنا المتخصصه بقى في قلب الحدث، يعني ندوه تكنولوجيا القطاع الحكومي ودور المواطنين في تفعيل الحكومه المنفتحه. دي هتعقد في كازيرتا ايطاليا في الربع الاخير من 2014. دي فيها كومبوننت متخصص عن الاوبن جفرمنت والاوبن داتا والافيلابيلتي في الاوبن جفرمنت والاوبن داتا. 2014 2015 برضو من احد الانشطه الحديثه بتاعتنا تقرير الحكومه الالكترونيه في العالم العربي. احنا عايزين نعرف العالم العربي عندنا احنا فين، ورايحين فين ونروح ازاي. يمكن 3/4 التقارير الموجوده على المنطقه العربيه اجزاء من تقارير دوليه زي تقرير الOECD زي تقرير اليونايتد نيشنز. الاسكو عندها بعض المحاولات دلوقتي شغاله عليها، بس المنطقه العربيه ال 22 دوله كخصوصيه وكطبيعه مختلفه شويه عن المنظمات الدوليه سواء بالمعايير سواء بالمؤشرات. دي الجديد اللي احنا بنحاول ان احنا نعمله في اصدارنا الخاص ب 2014 و2015. متشكرة ليكم جدا، وإن شاء الله أكون أوفيت المعلومات معينة عن المنظمة اللي أنتم محتاجين تعرفوها. شكرا.
Thank you very much. That was a fascinating exploration of the challenges and the necessary preconditions that we have to have in place to implement effective open data policies that will result in open government and will result in better and improved services. And it highlights one of the themes that has come out throughout today, again, about we tend to take for granted that these things are just happening and they're easy to do. But the presentation we've just heard shows, within a region, the complexity, the cultural diversity, the challenges that need to be addressed, and the tireless effort that organizations like yours need to do to bring the vision to reality. Last but hardly least, it's my great pleasure to introduce Rahman Lacombe from the Prime Minister of France's office. He's Head of Innovation for the Open Government Task Force. He's also a real live entrepreneur from Silicon Valley, which is a rarity at events like this, so it's a great pleasure to welcome him. And I hope you'll join me in a round of applause, because he's just spearheaded the introduction or the joining of France in the Open Government Partnership last Thursday, so his presentation is very timely.
Thank you very much. Indeed, it's with a great pleasure and great honor, dear guests and ladies and gentlemen, that I come with great news, because France, which I represent today, and specifically the Prime Minister's Open Government Data Task Force, just announced on Thursday that France was joining the Open Government Partnership. Now, of course, this is something we've been working up to over the past 3 years, nearly 3 years now. So it's with, again, pleasure that I share this news with you. And what I want to focus on today is what does this announcement that was made by the French president on April 11th and officially announced during the first Paris conference on open government and open data just at the end of last week. What does it mean, and why does it matter? And how did we get there? How did we very concretely, over the past 3 years in France, build some of the policies we've heard about today, some of the great ideas that we've shared and some of the speakers have shared? How very concretely, in terms of setting up a team, making sure we convince people inside government, the civil service, the political leaders, but also citizens with whom we work, that open government data is worth pursuing. So quite specifically, joining the Open Government Partnership means that France is now part of a larger club, a club of 64 countries that have decided to share best practices, to work together, to engage with innovators worldwide, with civil society, with NGOs, with citizens, in order to make the government more open, more accountable, and more responsive to citizens. And so, of course, what that means will vary by country, by culture, by political system, by administrative system, legal system. But this is an occasion for France to share what we've done with the world, and to learn from other countries, to learn from NGOs, from civil society, how we can improve the policies we're leading. Why does it matter? Well, it does matter a great deal to me, but the question, of course, is very justified. Why do we care about open government? Well, the answer from the efforts that we've, at least from our point of view, and taking into account the efforts we've led to open government data in France, the answer is that open data itself matters. And by building up efforts to have a more open, a more accountable government, France, by joining the OGP, will help its civil society, its government, its startups, its innovators, its developers bring open data policy and the benefits that we expect from it much further along. So let me say a few words about why open data matters. We've heard today, of course, of how it could become a tool, how it could become an instrument of policy. Bringing a French perspective to the topic, over the years, we've realized that what really resonates with policymakers and with decision makers is that open data is not something new. It is a new expression of very traditional democratic principles of transparency, principles of openness, principles of innovation. It is really where modernity meets tradition. It's how we make government enter the 21st century and take full advantage of the new technologies, the new behaviors, the disruptive evolutions that our world is going through to make government better and to serve our citizens better. It is also not only a new tool for government, but it's a tool that's very much expected. It's an instrument and a policy that people have expected more and more, and this deep and rising expectation is not something new. What you see behind me, we're talking about data, so I brought data. What you see behind me is a graph of the relative frequency of certain words in this case, the English language corpus. And the words are transparency, accountability, empowerment, and what you see is that they've been used more and more and more and more by writers, by commentators, by publicists, not over the past 2 years, not over the past 3, 5, 10 years, but literally since the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, you see these graphs going up. And what that tells us is that this expectation of transparency is not something new, it's not an epiphenomenon, it is something that is deep, that is rising, and it is here to stay. And so governments have to adapt to that new reality. Open data is the way we can do it, by holding governments to account, by providing data that makes them more transparent, by making governments more effective because they're open, because they collaborate with citizens among themselves, and by empowering innovators worldwide. So this is why open data matters a great deal to us. So let me give you a couple examples of very concrete things that French innovators and entrepreneurs, startups have done over the past few years with the data we've been able to release. First example is this visualization, very simple, great example. The newspaper Le Monde.fr, which you might know, used the raw data from the budget to build this visualization. Now this may seem very simple, but think of it. How often do you see the entire contribution of people to its government through taxes and through a government budget represented in such a simple way? This is actually making government understandable by citizens. That's a huge deal. Not only perspective on collective actions can be built through data, but also data can inform individual choices for consumers, for patients, and for voters as well. So this is an example of a project, a non-profit that was built in 2012 and that used public data in order to compare, well, to help its users compare political programs. It's of course a non-partisan platform. What they did is they pulled the programs from all the different parties running in the last legislative elections in France. And on every topic, they would provide all the parties' platforms and the data that would help you make a choice. So a more informed individual choice, thanks to data, is of course something positive. We talked about fact-checking as well. So providing data means that the public, this coarse public debate is anchored in facts. Public communication can benefit from open data. This is an example of a map of every single cultural event that was funded one way or the other by public sector in France, and it's an explosion of events. It's a beautiful way to represent a policy, in this case, a cultural policy. Another, I guess, broader theme is that data is great for visualization, but it's actually in and of itself a way to regulate markets through choice, through transparency. This example here is a map of all the healthcare choices, all the hospitals in France, with not only their services and infrastructure, but also the level of service that they provide and how it compares to other hospitals closer to home, farther to home. This was built by a startup with the health ministry in France. So again, an example of collaboration in the process. And I guess this opens a whole new world of new kinds of public services, the kind of evolutions we just heard about. What if we built new e-government and public services? What if we were able not only to provide information on what is happening, but what will happen? That's exactly what a French startup called Snips has done with an application that predicts the level of traffic in public transit, specifically in trains, thanks to historical data, but also a model that adapts in real time to what the users are saying. So if you're in the train and it's crowded, you can complain, and in real time, other people will know it. Probably they will wait a little bit, and your train will become better. So these examples are great, and I wish we could spend the entire talk talking about what we can build with this data. But the reality is, in order to get there, it took 3 years of hard work, a very dedicated team with which I've been very lucky to work for the past 3 years. It took a lot of support. It also took a lot of demand from the civil society in France and abroad. And the steps I want to share with you today are the ones that led us to being able to have this first foray into open data and probably lay the ground for what will follow. So the great thing about building open data in France is that we've built them on top of the principles that brought our country together, so the principles of the French Revolution. And I'm not kidding, in 1789, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, which is still part of our constitution, says, Article 15, society has the right to hold any public agent accountable of its administration. Now, this may seem like a very general principle, but it's exactly what open data is about. And that principle has helped us in a lot of ways, in meetings, in discussions, to really bring debate forward. Closer to home in 1978, the law on the right to access information in France ended the concept of administrative secret, which literally said that everything administrative was by default secret, turned this principle onto its head, and made it so that every bit of public information was available to citizens, except for very strictly defined confidentiality exceptions, privacy, of course, personal privacy, trade secrets, national security, but by default, information is open, and there's an independent authority that citizens could appeal to in cases of recourses. This meant access to information, and open data is much more than access. It's also reusing data. So a first example of what could become open data later on was when in 1997, a first website was created with all law, access to all law. And now that sounds quite hard to believe then in a country such as France, with our, of course, Napoleonic Code and the importance that we can imagine civil law has in everyday life, law was not accessible. Well, it was. You just had to pay literally hundreds of francs, it was before the euro, a minute to access them through private services on the Minitel, the ancestor to internet that France was very proud to have invented. And now, of course, taking advantage of these new developments, putting every single law and executive order online made it much easier for people to access this information. And that was a step towards creating the first kind of a common infrastructure, informational infrastructure that open data is about. It was still a first step because we were still talking about right to access, but not right to information, which came in 2003 when the European directive created a right, or at least asked every member state to create not only a right to access, but also to reuse information. And that is the crucial insight and the crucial aspect of transitioning from access to information as a potential right to open data as an effective right. Going from a world of documents that are analog, synthetic, static, to a world where data can be reused because it's digital, because it's granular, it's precise, it's dynamic, it changes in real time, or at least every time data is updated. So it becomes an instrument. It becomes an instrument for innovators, for developers, for researchers, and for data entrepreneurs. In 2010, when I started working on the topic. Open data came on the agenda in France, partly through some of the work civil society did, partly for some of the work researchers did, petitioning the government for access to information. And I was lucky enough at that point to work with a team of great researchers and students on a report on open data, what it could be, what it could mean, that we started circulating in late 2010 and handed to the Minister for Digital Economy in 2011. And at that point, the idea of open data was moving forward. In July 2010, the Committee on Public Sector Modernization, headed by the President of the French Republic, decided that open data was going to be on the agenda. In November 2010, the idea of a task force was created by the Council of Ministers, and that led us to this task force I'm a part of today, which literally has been a startup built inside government. So the task force itself is called État Lab, as a play of word on government and a laboratory. So it very much is a experimental, iterative, as innovative as we can be. It's a task force that is tasked with releasing, well, at least coordinating the release of data among all the different governmental and ministerial departments. We started, I think, 5 of us. We grew up to 8 or 9. And our work has very much been trying to create relationships with decision makers, relationships with civil servants who actually work with the data, who understand it, who know how it's structured, how it's produced, how we can extract it. And relationships, of course, with the people using it, with civil society, entrepreneurs, and researchers. A few months after the creation of the task force, a first formal executive order formalized France's open data strategy, its objectives, innovation, modernization, transparency. It was the first commitment from the French government to free reuse of data, which has been an issue, and we'll talk about it in a moment. And it started, at least as a first product of the first conversations we've had at that point with civil society in the first open workshops we had held. We released later that year the open license being an adaptation of the Creative Commons license to French law. It looks a little bit like it. And the idea was to have a clear, very simple, very easy to understand legal document that would explain exactly what you could do with the data that was released, what it meant, what the government agency releasing it was committing itself to, and what you could do, which is everything as long as, of course, you don't break the law. And that license represents, I think, something like 60+ meetings, hundreds of stakeholders inside, outside the administration. I think someone was saying this morning that when there's no law, then you don't know what you can do. Well, in this case, we made very sure that there was a precise document that said this is what you're allowed to do with this data. And at the end of that year, we launched the first beta version of data.gouv.fr, the national platform for open data from the national government, with some core data sets, the national budget that I talked about. It's been, of course, renewed and updated every year, fiscal policy, data on education and environment, road safety, crime data, you name it. A lot of ministries contributed to this first version, and even though it was a very, very early first step, we had thousands of data sets with whom data reusers could play, and that's what happened pretty much over the course of 2012. People learning about the site, calling us, engaging with us, us trying to go to a lot of events, trying to become a part of this community and make sure that the data we had was being used as much as possible. So hosting, we talked about hackathons, contests, we hosted some of them, participated in many events over weekends, over nights, and sometimes outside of government, sometimes, and this is the picture I chose to illustrate this point, inside of the beautiful French offices. This is not where we work every day, but it was quite nice to be able to bring about 20 or 30 designers inside of the Prime Minister's offices working on a government jam, a gov jam, trying to invent new public services based on data. To try to systematize and make this approach more effective, we also built a community a community of innovators, trying to connect some of the data-driven startups to the partners, the talents, the resources that the French economy could bring them. French economy meaning, of course, companies out of France and specifically the large network industries, the smart cities industries that have come out of France, but also some of the global companies such as Google, Microsoft, Orange, some of the local researchers as well. So it's been quite an interesting mix. And these partners have helped us select through 4 different contests that we called Data Connections, more than 32 startup laureates. Some of which you can see here, the example of Tranquillien, the upper left was this predictive public service application. There's a lot more, and I'd be very happy to tell you about some of the really inventive things that we've seen come through this. And finally, as you're aware, in 2012 we had a change of government, and so there was a new strategy that was put in place that really included open data as an element of its modernization strategy. So we joined this broader Secretariat General for Public Sector Modernization, working directly with the state CIO to make sure that everything related to IT services was made with openness in mind. And so I guess this is what we've been working on for the past year to year and a half. How do we move from the first steps of an open data policy to what would be the basis of our open government action plan? So in 2013, this new strategy that I was referring to was formalized through a roadmap, a broader digital roadmap for the government that specifically said that, I guess renewed the commitment that the government had made to open data, and every single minister of the government had signed a charter committing himself or herself to opening data and making it reusable for free from his or her ministerial department. And the new announcement in that roadmap was in order to move forward with access to information on topics that are, of course, key to the public sector. We decided to launch public debates through which we would bring together both data producers, people in the departments, people in the agencies, but also those of us who would like to use them. Entrepreneurs again, but also civil society organizations, researchers, NGOs, and the 6 key topics that were chosen for the first debates were healthcare, transportation, environment, research and science, fiscal policy, and housing. So issues that matter for everyday purposes, but also, of course, strategic questions where data can make a difference. We've experienced with collaborative open data policy making, meaning that the new version of data.gouv.fr that was in the works was designed collaboratively with some of the people who followed us all along and who used the data on data.gouv.fr. We had, I think in a span of less than 2 months, we had 12 different events in and out of government to make sure we captured all the requirements from our community. On the international stage, we also had a very interesting collaboration with the governments of the G8. And in June, at the last G8 summit, the heads of state actually committed their countries to open data for a more transparent world and to this idea that we would collectively engage with innovators worldwide. And that was a first and quite an impressive achievement as well. So open data was both entering French society in our case, but also becoming an international question. And I guess it's quite fitting that it's a UN forum that gathers us today to discuss those very, very important developments. Another question that we talked about was the question of reuse of data. Now, granted, open data has to be free, otherwise it's not open. But unfortunately, some very few, but unfortunately important agencies in France, but that's the case in some other parts of the world as well, had developed over time business models that supported the collection of some of the data. And so we've worked very hard, and a report was written to the Prime Minister by an expert who's both a fiscal policy expert and a contributor to open source projects, which is quite rare. He was able to convince the government that we needed to find new models for these specific agencies. The example that I quoted earlier, Légifrance, so that website where everyone could come and read the law, is now switching to a model where everyone can also download it and reuse it, even though it created a precedent with I guess, legal editions that is, of course, quite complicated in the information industries. But this is, again, the tools that we've used to progress in that direction. It's going to be the case with other kinds of data moving forward. And again, the G8 Open Data Charter committed France to working on an action plan and releasing at the end of this past year the new data.gov.fr, which is a first in a way, not necessarily technically speaking, but as a platform, it's the first time a national government releases an open data platform that's not only open to the civil service and people who can release data that they collect, but also to everyone. So literally all of us here can create an account on data.gov.fr and publish some of our data. Now granted, there are mechanisms that make it so that if the data is not that interesting, people won't see it in the search results, so it's going to be buried. But if you have interesting data around France or France in the world or some activity that you're running in France, this is a way to share improvements to data that we collectively have built. And this leaves us with our conclusion. Moving forward, while we will be building on this open data momentum, this new platform that I just presented has actually doubled the rate of data reuse that we've measured. We went from 300-400 data applications to something, I think we have more than 900 now. We've expanded and we will keep on expanding our international collaboration. And again, it's a pleasure to be here today. And the action plan for the Open Government Partnership has been announced for November. So be on the lookout. We'll be delighted to engage with all of you again. I kept for the end 2 lessons that we learned through those 3 years of open data policy in France. They're very simple. The first one is that platforms work better than pyramids. And if that image of Le Louvre doesn't capture the message here, what we mean is governments can serve citizens much more effectively by working like networks rather than hierarchies, but working like platforms that empower people. And that's the second lesson. If you want to work with them, innovators, empower them. We really see again and again and again that citizens are eager to collaborate for the greater good. So listen to them, help them out, but let them innovate. Thank you very much.